Hello and welcome to RUACH, which stands for Religious Understanding and Community Harmony. It is our effort, the clergy from across different denominations in Lynn, to talk about current issues of our day from the lens of faith. Today, we are going to be speaking about mass incarceration, which doesn't mean Massachusetts incarceration, though it exists there, but a mass incarceration system where a great number of people are incarcerated and where the numbers of people incarcerated in our country has multiplied 20-fold in the past 30 years. And we now, as a nation, have the highest incarceration rates of any country in the entire world. So we're going to be talking today about what the problems are, why some of us are working on it, and what do our faith traditions have to say about that. But before we begin, I am pleased to welcome our other guests, and I will let them introduce themselves. First, I am Rabbi Margie Klein-Ronkin, and I work with the Essex County Community Organization and Congregation Sharei Shalom.
And I'm Reverend Jane Gould. I'm the pastor of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church here in Lynn.
And I'm Father Brian Flynn, the pastor of the Lynn Catholic Collaborative of St. Mary's and Sacred Heart here in Lynn.
Thank you. And soon to join us will be Reverend Andre Bennett from Zion Baptist Church, who was unavoidably detained, but will be coming very soon. So, to my colleagues, thank you so much for being here. I want to just begin by asking you, what has made this issue live for you? What are you concerned about when we talk about mass incarceration?
So for me, the number that we have 20 times as many people in prisons than we did 30 years ago, I don't think we've gotten that much worse as people. So what's going on that we actually are incarcerating that many people? But what's more deeply troubling for me is that in Massachusetts, right? In Massachusetts, which we think of as kind of progressive and liberal and these sorts of things as a state, if you are a person of color, you're 8 times more likely to be incarcerated than if you're white. 8 times. And the national average is like 5.7 times more likely. So the national average isn't good either, but that ours is even that much higher is really deeply troubling to me as someone serving a faith community in Massachusetts. So it really is mass incarceration.
And I think for me, what I find most striking is really the money being spent to keep these people in jail, or being spent to punish and penalize people, which in a sense perpetuates the problem, or at least keeps somebody in there without giving them hope, probably leading them into despair and what do I do, as opposed to that funding being used to help to teach, to help with substance abuse, to help rehabilitate, whatever needs to be done to make that person a productive, member of society, if that's what's needed.
Yeah. Just to continue on what you're saying from the economic perspective, we pay $49,000 a year for each person that is in jail or prison. Well, in Middleton Jail here in Essex County, 43% of those people haven't even been convicted of a crime. They're just there awaiting trial. A high percentage of them just because they can't afford bail. So in essence, it almost becomes like a debtor's prison. Why are you there? Because you're poor. Right. And when we think about the fact that race can play a role in who gets arrested and what crime they're charged with, it's even and often because of different structures in our society, people of color have less money. It can mean that we're just compounding and layering on more and more racist outcomes so that the number of people in jail is so much higher for people of color.
Well, and the other thing for me is, and some of this comes sort of through my role working on the board of the Lynn Community Health Center, we have so many people in our Lynn population who are dealing with substance use disorders and behavioral health issues. And like overwhelmingly, and I think some statistics would say more than half of the people incarcerated in Middleton are folks who suffer with those medical conditions of a substance use, an addiction disorder, or a behavioral health issue. And surely prison doesn't make them bad, doesn't heal them. And so it's getting back, like we're investing $49,000 a year to keep them there, and they are likely getting sicker by being there rather than better.
And I would think economically also, just as you say, with bail comes that fact that pleading guilty to crimes that maybe I just know this is my only way to proceed in this. I can't defend myself against a greater charge, so I need to plead guilty and try to get this over with as quickly as I can. There's no option for me.
Well, right, and if you put on top of that mandatory minimums, which I think a lot of people saw as this is get tough on crime and our neighborhoods are being torn apart by crime, but the way we're seeing them have an effect on our community is that folks who may or may not be guilty of a crime are pleading guilty to some bargained lesser charge because there's this threat of, well, either you plead guilty now or you're in for the mandatory 15, and there's no way out for you then. And so folks will say, well, I can't take that chance. And given the weakness of public defender systems in most instances, and mostly not necessarily because they're bad attorneys, but their caseload is so unreasonable in the public defender's office that folks just, they figure, well, this is my best shot. And their attorney may not even know the particulars of their situation. And they may not fully have the capacity to understand the choices and decisions they're making. So we've been laying out welcome, Andre. We are glad you got here. We are glad.
We shared that you were unavoidably detained, but it's so good to have you.
I really was. Incidentally, I was trying to navigate my way for a visit from a young man from my church. I believe I shared the story with some of us yesterday, who was sentenced for a crime that he may or may not have committed, but served the full sentence that was handed down to him. He served 7 years behind bars and 2 years at home under house arrest, and just got a call at the end of the 2 years that there was a technicality upon why he was released, and so he was sent back sometime in 2015, and he is still just sitting, waiting, being transferred from one place to the next. And so that's actually what I was dealing with on the phone, why I didn't get your text, because I have Sprint and their text service and their phone line don't work with his dad. Now he's in North Central Correctional Institution, which I didn't even know existed, someplace in Gardner, Mass.
So are you saying even though I remember you said he was sentenced to 5 to 9 years. Mm-hmm. So even though he's now been back in jail for over 2 more years, and he was in jail before for 7 years, so that the total has been more than 9 years, the new 3 years that he's been in jail don't count.
It doesn't.
That's just him waiting around.
That's just him waiting around. And my understanding, and I intend to go visit him on Friday, which is now his new visiting time. My understanding is that he could be tried, the case could be called up, and a judge, because it's not a jury case, a judge could decide that you need to serve the additional 2 years from the 9 that you were released. So the 2 years house arrest would not have been counted. The almost 3 years that he's sitting and waiting would not be counted. So that's 5 years of his life that would not be counted. And he might have to serve an additional 2 years. And that is dependent on when it's, because he still doesn't have a date as to when that's going to be called up.
And you're laughing, but it's like you almost have to laugh because otherwise you're going to cry.
Well, if I don't laugh, I'm going to say things that I can't say
On TV.
on TV.
That's right.
So,
And just in terms of the different issues, one of the things we raised is bail and the way that race and poverty play a role in who gets incarcerated. We also talked about mandatory minimums. There are 1,800 people in Massachusetts who pled guilty and took plea bargains so as not to be given a mandatory minimum. So even though they may have not done a crime at all or done a crime that deserved a mandatory minimum, they're pleading guilty because they're afraid that, and the mandatory minimum is being used as a threat and as a tool. And so that's one of the things a lot of people have been organizing around. Another thing that's important to note is that right now in Massachusetts, we have an over 60% recidivism rate. That means if you get out of jail, there's a 60% chance you're going to wind up back in jail. Now, all of us want to have safe communities. No matter who you are, what community you're from, you want to be safe. Of course you do. But the argument, I think, for why we have tough on crime policies or strong sentencing or any of that is to make our communities safer. And so one of the things we have to look at is that working? Right. And what we are seeing is that what's going on right now actually isn't working to keep people out of jail. It's getting people in this cycle where they wind up back in jail, and actually in places where they have lessened, they've gotten rid of mandatory minimums, which has led to fewer people in jail, which has led states to save money and often reinvest them in programs for drug treatment, mental health, re-entry services for people coming out of prison, that actually the crime rates have gone way down. On average, 7.4% for violent crimes, 14.1% for other crimes. So there's a real difference when you give people another chance. And the reason for that actually is sort of common sense, I think, which is that if you have served in jail for a long time and then you come out, well, you have a criminal record, so it's hard to get a job, and it's hard to get housing because you're not eligible for public housing, and sometimes you can't vote. There's a bunch of different, sometimes you can't get a driver's license, so there's a bunch of different ways that it's very difficult to get started again. And yes, people say, okay, if you did the crime, you have to do the time, but when does the time end? If someone does something wrong, is it a 2-year sentence or a life sentence?
Well, so one of my parishioners came out of prison, and he had lost his driver's license. Well, there was you have to pay the big. We've now eliminated the fee you have to pay to get your driver's license back. But a few years ago, you had to pay a whopping fee to get your driver's license back, even if your crime had nothing to do with anything involving motor vehicles. And so he had no driver's license. So I volunteered to drive him someplace. We're driving along. He's telling me about how every time he gets sent down, he learns another trick. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is maybe not the smartest thing I ever decided to do, but this is someone I knew well. And I thought, right, this is a guy who had a substance use disorder, right? Never when he was incarcerated did anyone deal with addiction. And he would get let out, and rather than having gotten, tools for dealing with addiction, he'd learn new ways to manipulate and scam and commit crime. And given that, as you say, the traditional economy blocks you, housing won't let you in, and also, a lot of folks in the community are like, I don't want you hanging around my children, and sort of reasonably, like, they can't volunteer in our schools, they can't volunteer in our churches, and they're looking for a way to be productively engaged, and every single place they turn, there's a stop sign. And so people are essentially saying, A, serving time never ends, and you are not welcome here. You know, it's creating a legitimized system of an underclass. And when you put that together with people of color being 8 times more likely in Massachusetts to be sent to prison, well, golly, that looks a whole lot like Jim Crow, right?
Absolutely. And that is why you find the rate, that word rate.
You just have to say it fast.
So high.
Then no one notices when you don't get all the letters in the right order.
Because when you think about it, if you have served time for a crime, whether you did or didn't,
Right.
You've gone to the rehabilitation center, because that's what it's really supposed to be, and you're released after you've paid your debt. You're released, and your life ceases to exist or exist in a normal fashion. My brother lives with me, and a lot of us in the city of Lynn and various congregations fought like crazy to get him to be free after a number of years. And I get questioned from people who you would least expect those questions from. Aren't you scared to have him around when your son's there?
Yeah.
Questions like that. So even people who are best intended no longer can look at this person in any kind of normalcy. But let us step away from that. Just being arrested changes your life forever. I was told by an immigration officer that, listen, you were assigned a number. You were given a number that starts with CR, that stands for criminal record, and whatever else the number is. And he said, whenever you go anywhere outside of the state of Massachusetts and you enter your fingerprint, you are going to be delayed for at least an hour and a half from getting any service.
CR.
Because that number comes up. What doesn't come up is what was the reason you were assigned that number, and if there are other offenses. So what they have to do, they have to put you aside. They now have to contact the Department of Corrections or wherever in Massachusetts, give them your number, and they have to run that number to see everything else. And so that changes your life. You're walking with something over you that you think you're okay, but you're really not okay.
Right.
You know what I mean? You can be pulled over, which I didn't even know that. You can be pulled over and be detained, be taken to the police station, not arrested now, but just detained because they have to check. They have to do a background check because you have a CR number. And so when you think of those who have served time, a great percentage, I'm not going to put a number because I could be incorrect, a great percentage of who are serving time for crime that they didn't commit. They just agreed to something because it might be the easier way out. One, you have color working against you. You have your socioeconomic position working against you. So you serve time and you come out. Your life, there's no job. Family members don't trust you, one.
Right.
And two, myself, like you, Reverend Jane, who has a big heart and want to give you a ride someplace, and hearing about your stories. Even us sometimes are thinking, oh Lord, what did I, just get me there safely. And believe me, these projections are known. When I sit at my dining table and I have a conversation with my brother, these projections are known.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's almost as if there is an expectation that someone that looks like me has a record, let alone when you actually have that record. And so you wonder, I often wonder, what is the purpose of prison? What is the purpose of, I get the whole, I want my community to be safe.
Right.
But what's the purpose outside of, because the community still isn't very safe when you think about it.
And I think also, like you're describing your brother's case, you know, we use those phrases, get tough on crime, make the streets safe. But yet we don't feel any safer when
No, right.
Exactly.
So why do we keep getting tough on crime if that's not making us any safer, making us feel any safer?
But let's think about it. Are we getting tough on crime, or are we getting tough on a certain demographic
Correct.
of individuals?
Well, and it's also, part of what we know is that the single best predictor of someone ending up in prison is an inability to read in second grade, right? And that is race-based, class-based, right? So not an ability not to read. So wouldn't it make more sense to invest in education at that level than to build a prison bed for that person because they're going to end up there, right?
It just seemed like it would make sense. And not just to invest in education, but go into the inner cities.
Cheaper.
It is way cheaper. It is, I feel like, and I'm a parent, and thankfully my son won't be seeing this, but for me, it's way cheaper to send my child to school than to feed him every single day. So I'm thinking that it is way cheaper to educate a people than to have the prison houses packed with them and having to provide meals per day and
oversight.
And oversight, like. And then there's the education piece of it. We often say this education system is bad and that education system is terrible. But when you really think about it, I don't know if it's the education system that's the problem, or it's the area or the location. Because when I have the privilege of traveling to the Lawrence and the Haverhill and the Methuen and North Andover and Plastow, New Hampshire, and these places. And there is a major difference when it comes on to the quality of resources on a whole in say, a North Andover as against a Haverhill, which is just a drive over. Right. You know what I mean? So it's almost as if, in my mind, it's almost as if we're already, and I say we because I identify as a black person. You might not be able to tell just looking at me, but I do. No, you wouldn't know just looking at me. But I identify. But we're already operating at a disadvantage where that is concerned. And then you keep pulling from our educational resources. And then we are given the dregs of society, the bottom of the barrel, to make a way on. It's almost as if we are damned to end up at this place even before birth. You know what I mean? Let's see how well we can pack the house. And so what is the prison? What is the system? Is it a political thing? Is it a community thing? What is it? I don't know, and that's what I've been trying to figure out. Like, who benefits from this? Because it certainly isn't the community. So who benefits from this?
Well, I think that part of what I find useful in sort of taking apart the different strands of this very tangled web is looking at the history of how the system came to be. Because again, it's 20 times bigger than it used to be in a very short amount of time. So something happened. And tragically and interestingly, something I've been learning from reading The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander and watching the documentary The 13th is that with the growth of the civil rights movement, it stopped being politically acceptable to actually just say we don't like black people or we don't like people of color. And it has become public in the files of the campaign files of Richard Nixon and one of his lead campaigners that they came up with a strategy that said, if we can't talk about race, let's come up with a way of talking to Southern whites who are voting Democrat and woo them over to our side. So what we'll do is we'll show images of criminals who are black and then say, we're going to be tough on crime. And then also we're going to show images of hippies who are white and say we're going to be tough on drugs. And by doing those things, the idea was that then you could get Southern whites to vote Republican. And whether or not you support Republicans or Democrats, that was a political strategy that actually really worked. But what it meant was that criminality and race were intentionally tied together for a political reason, which was to recruit people who were racist to join a different party. And so more and more tough on crime, the images that were paired with the idea of tough on crime were images of black people, even in situations where the crime rates amongst white people were much higher. And that has continued and continued in terms of the ways that it has been portrayed. And the black community has consistently said, we don't feel like we're being treated right in this system. And more, it's become a wedge issue where people on one side will say Black Lives Matter and the other side say police lives matter, as if, of course, yes, all lives matter. And the reason that some people, I think, are saying Black Lives Matter is because they feel like in the incarceration system and in other parts of our society, they are being treated as if their lives aren't equal because they seem more disposable in this system where we can just sort of warehouse a large percentage of people. 1 in 4 black men wind up in jail right now, even though crime rates are not nearly, are fairly equal between black communities and white communities. And so just thinking about that history, on the one hand, it's very depressing, but on the other hand, I actually think, okay, well, if navigating politics over the course of 30 years got us here, then maybe we can be navigating politics to get us in a different direction.
Right.
So I would love to hear from you all and share some myself about what is it that we're actually asking for? What is it that we want that we feel would make things better? Because I don't think we're just saying, let's just all open the gates and have a party. That's not what we're saying. So what are we saying?
But here's the thing. Let me share a story real quickly before I get to what I'm asking for, because sometimes I'm not very sure if what I'm asking for is realistic too. When you have here in the city of Lynn, a 53-year-old white man go around and steal over 50,000 lights, Christmas lights, off of a resident's home, and because he was drunk, and the police chief, 3 days later, this man turned himself into the police, and the police chief said, well, he apologized, he was drunk, and we all had a good laugh about it, and no charges were pressed against him because he doesn't have a record, he never had a record before. And that's okay. But you have a 16-year-old kid who picks up an apple, sitting in class across from his classmate, like I'm sitting across from you, picks up an apple, look at the classmate, whatever a seductive look is, I'm not sure, but looked at his classmate, licked the apple and bit into the apple. But then 6 months later, he's a registered level 1 sex offender. I'm not sure what my ask should be at that point in time. A 16-year-old kid who never had a record prior to licking an apple and putting his teeth in the apple, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're supposed to lick an apple and put your teeth in it. So he never had a criminal record before, but the system has no issue whatsoever in registering him as a level 1 sex offender at 16 years old. And in order for that registration to be lifted, he has to go through a 4-year college and graduate and then revisit the system for that to be lifted, or that record to be cleared, whatever the parent that shared it with me said. But a man, a 53-year-old white man, with all his senses working, stole something from somebody's house, and the chief of police says, well, we had a good laugh because we thought it was all. What should my ask be as a black man with a 14-year-old son? What should my ask be then? Because I'm not sure what question to ask, what to expect at this point in time. Because that in itself, we're not talking about 30 years ago. We're not talking about 25 years ago. We're not talking about 5 years ago. I'm talking about 14 months ago. That in itself tells me that we are still operating at a severe disadvantaged. We're still, and again, I'm not talking about things that are happening in South, and I'm talking about things that are happening here at home. It tells me that my son runs the risk of getting a criminal record for walking one day home from school and probably holding the front of his pants while a white person is walking down the street. It's sexual harassment, and he's a level 1 sex offender. Yet someone can break into someone's home. And so at this point, I'm not sure anything that we ask is gonna sound like it's a realistic, comfortable ask, because what then is right for us to do? What then is comfortable with society for me being a black man? I was watching Family Guy last night as I waited, which don't ever watch Family Guy, but I was watching Family Guy. And the episode was, Peter Griffin, who is the Family Guy, accidentally shot his friend's son, who is a black man and a black kid. And Peter Griffin was being defended by the community because he's a white man who shot a black kid. And in court, the defense attorney, now this is way out, but in court, the defense attorney gave the kid, while on the stand, took a knife out, asked permission if I can approach the witness, and ask is it okay for the witness to pick the knife up. And so he said to the kid, well, pick the knife up. And the kid picked the knife up, and he said, oh my God, he has a knife in court. And all the court officers were on this kid. And so to end it, the father, stood up and said, well, Peter didn't shot my son. The father is also black. He said, Peter didn't shot my son. I shot my son accidentally, and he gave a whole meal. And by the time he got through his speech, the courtroom was empty. The cameras were gone. And so Peter said to him, what just happened? He said, if you want the media to go away, if you want the attention to go away, mention black on black crime, and that will solve it. So that, again, it's a way off, but that tells me that something's wrong, because I can maybe randomly kill whoever I need to kill once he's black, and chances are, I'll get a good defense team, and I'll be sitting here next Wednesday again. However, if I look at Jane too hard or say anything that's, and Jane chooses to be vindictive, I could end up in prison for 5 years. So what do I ask in them? What do I ask for?
I think part of what you're bringing up is that injustice and racism exists on so many different levels. It's in our own hearts and our own biases and attitudes. It's between people and the way people treat each other. It's in the structures and systems and policies, and then it's in sort of cultural stories and narratives that we tell ourselves. And so if we try and change one policy, but we don't change our hearts and minds and relationships and stories, it's not going to do it. It's not going to finish the job. And we saw that with the civil rights movement. Great, we have the Civil Rights Act, okay, but there's still a lot of racism out there. So on the one hand, it's not enough, and on the other hand, I personally feel like if we don't, we have to start somewhere. And I think part of that is, we worked with the Lynn police last year, you were very much a part of it, on doing implicit bias training with the police, which comes with the assumption that we all have bias, and that bias, when it is racial bias, is negatively affecting the black community and communities of color because of exactly the type of thing that you're talking about. So teachers should have that training. Everyone should basically have that training, but anybody that is in a public position should be required to have that training, and that's something that we need to fight for, because individuals have power to make those kinds of decisions on a day-to-day basis. But then also, we need to change the policies that are actually having the effect of keeping people in jail for way too long. And we have to do that while talking about race, because there's a whole group of neoconservatives who are realizing it's really expensive to put people in jail. Let's stop. And that's great. It's a lot of progress. That's why a lot of criminal justice reform can happen. And if it's not happening in a conversation about race, I think it's pretty likely that somehow racism will pop up in some other form.
And I just want to say, I've been involved, through ECHO with some of this, not as active as you and Maji, but when Margie first asked that question, what's the question we should ask, or what should we do? As the white man, I sit here going, well, we can just do something about mandatory sentences, something about investing more money, like the simple answers. I mean, simple in a way when I hear your story, you know what I mean? And as I think about what my answer to that question that I'm running through my mind, it's the farthest thing. It doesn't address your concern, because even though I have heard those stories before, believe those stories, read the statistics, I'm still somewhat immune to it. You know what I mean? It just does not affect. I mean, I'll never forget the time you told the story about, I think it was the police car following you or your son through, Lynn or something. And I'm thinking, gosh, I get nervous sometimes if I go through a light and they start to follow me, what's going to happen? What about just being followed because of who I am? I mean, and those things, I just think so many people can't relate to that, in all honesty. I mean, and me who is involved, who does try to educate myself, who listens to the stories, still struggle with that, or think simple answers are still available.
I think what's hard for us, and I suspect is hard for those who watch us and listen to us, is that we do have internalized implicit bias that is racially motivated, and the studies of it show it affects people regardless of what their own race is. So people of color are trained to mistrust their own folks because the culture tells them you are more likely to be a criminal than Father Brian is. Just by definition. I think, I think basically most of your DNA matches, actually. Right?
Absolutely.
But somehow he's less criminal than you are. Why? And we, as women, are less criminal than both of you.
Absolutely.
Right?
And we're not saying, I think often police get a bad rap in this story because it's like, oh, police are the bad guy.
Yeah.
But the point is more, we all have this voice inside of us, or a lot of different voices that are saying, do you see that guy? Maybe we should cross the street, or whatever is that saying. But police are the ones that are thinking that and have a gun,
And
so,
not thinking it in a mindful, conscious way. Right. I mean, that was what was really significant for me when Professor Rachel Godsill did the implicit bias training with ECHO and the command staff of the Lynn Police Department, was when she talked about, our minds can consciously process sort of 40 things in a second, right? They're like, they can be attentive to consciously. Yet our bodies, we have to breathe, we have to pump blood, are actually processing millions of information bits every second. And implicit bias is among those millions of bits, and it protects us, right? We have these things planted because you don't have time to think through everything. But the problem is, if you're a police officer with a gun and your implicit bias, not your conscious thought, but this stuff that is in that sort of part of your brain that you're not attentive to, says, danger. You're right, you're responding to a perception of danger, which is why the criminal justice system keeps letting them off, right? Tamir Rice, why? He felt himself in danger? Really? Seriously? You feel in danger? And the answer is, well, yeah, if you're governed by implicit bias, that is a true statement, right?
But the good news is that we all have implicit bias, but sort of surprisingly, we can retrain ourselves.
We can.
So we're not a hopeless cause. And that was sort of shocking to me, because I feel like as a person of faith and faith leader, I'm supposed to have this really positive view of humanity. But when I look at all the pain in the world and all the inequality, sometimes I think, oh, nothing can change. But hearing about the ways that, when police officers actually have implicit bias training, they make different choices. Yeah. And when right now in the state of Massachusetts, the key legislators, Speaker DeLeo, Senator President Rosenberg, Governor Baker, and Chief Justice Gant of the Supreme Judicial Court, they all came together. They agreed we have a problem and we have to do something. And so they got this organization to do a big study, which is called the Council of State Governments. But they told them, we don't really want to do that much. We just want to focus on post-prison programming. And they sort of, they asked them to do some things, but they told them not to look at race. And so this big study that was commissioned completely ignored anything about racial outcomes and racial inequality. Now, if you actually want to change something in regards to race, you need to know what the problem is. We know there's inequality. It's 8 times more likely as a black person than a white person that you're going to wind up in jail.
Even though statistics on committing crime are the same.
So the question is, well, where is the problem? Is the problem with who's getting pulled over? Is it who's getting sentenced? Is it what the sentence is? Is it what the treatment is in prison? I mean, the truth is we think it's
quality of legal defense.
It's every single
Right.
step probably, but we need to understand how it's working so that we can monitor it and manage it. And if nobody even knows what's going on, there can't be accountability and there can't be correction.
But here's the issue that I had with the Council of State Government, whatever they are. No disrespect to anyone. The study that they looked at was post-prison program. That's after the problem. Why can't we do a study about pre-prison?
Well, they actually, misspoke. They did look at all of it, but then they were guided to only make recommendations about the end, which
so
completely misses the point. And can you just say more about why does that completely miss the point? Because what would actually stop recidivism? Is that enough?
And
No.
that is my issue. I used to serve at North Shore Community College on a project called Project Yes, which is a youth, whatever, I forgot what the letters stand for. I forget my name sometimes, honestly. I told Jane today, I didn't remember today was Wednesday. I really didn't remember it was Wednesday. And one of the criteria for boys to get into the Yes program, and that's why I stepped down from serving that program. One of the criteria, or the main criteria for boys to get into the program, they must, in all caps, be failing school to get into the program. Why on earth do you have a program that facilitates failure? Why isn't there a program to look at why our boys are failing school? Why our boys aren't doing well? Why isn't there enough programs in place? Why aren't there things in place to prevent our 18 and our 19 and our 21-year-olds from going to prison to begin with? I am very happy and grateful that you're looking at what we can do to prevent recidivism. I got it right this time. To prevent that. I am happy that there's something looking at that. There's something in place to look at that. But I want us to focus on why we have an overflow of men of color and Latinos and Hispanics sitting in prison for years on ending. That's what I want us to look at.
Well, and also one of the really fundamental flaws of where they focus their attention is, I think, if we look at the state budget, and this last quarter we know declining revenues. If you look at the state budget, they're not going to fund programs unless there's a place in the system to save money. And what we've seen again and again in studies is that the way to save money is not to have mandatory minimums, to provide treatment rather than alternatives to incarceration in forms of treatment, to reclassify felonies as misdemeanors, right? Like you've got this whole list of stuff that saves money, to make a bail system that is more accessible or has some sort of alternative commitment than cash for folks who simply don't have cash. So you don't have 43% of the people never convicted of anything, right? Like
And it's not just about saving money. It's also, why are people going back to jail? Is it just because they didn't have a good post-prison program? Or is it because the longer you're in jail, the more you're disconnected from your support system? And
Right.
the longer that you're in jail, the harder it is for you to get a job afterwards. And even if you have a good post-prison program, all of the experience of being in jail is, we would hope that it's a rehabilitative system, but what we're seeing is that it seems like it's actually more designed as a system of punishment, or what people call warehousing, that it's just like, we don't want to have to deal with these people, so let's just sort of put them away.
Even though we do have like a 20 times higher prison population than we had 30 years ago, and certainly a much higher percentage of the population than we ever had before, my first life had me in graduate school in history and in social history. And my advisor, actually, her specialty, one of them was prison reform. And so what her first book looked at was the movement in America from a reform-based reintegration prison system to a punishment-based prison system, and a desire to sort of contain and control. And so we clearly are on the cycle of the contain and control, but what we have mindfully overlayered it with in the last 30 years is, here's a way to contain and control people of color. And so the phenomenon of moving reform, punish, reform, punish is not new to us as a nation, but the desire to contain and control a specific demographic group
Through massacre.
through the
There was
system.
already efforts to contain and control in other ways.
Yes.
Audrey, you talked earlier about, the Republicans looking at the South, and how it took 30 years in this, and how maybe politically we can get out of it. Do you think by focusing on just the post-prison, do you think that's a conscious effort to keep, as Jane is talking, to keep everybody down, or do you think it's just kind of ignorance and unwillingness to explore the other,
Sure. So let me just respond in a couple ways. First of all, I just want to say, to not throw the Republicans under the bus in this case, that also, Bill Clinton was he ran as tough on crime because he realized he couldn't win he thought he couldn't win unless he also had that same message, because he wanted to get those Southern white people back too, and thought that was the way that he was going to get them. So it is not only Republicans that are doing this, it is people across the board. Post-prison, I don't think that, I think, to be honest, it's like, originally, when Charlie Baker was running, he said that he believed in mandatory minimum reform. As he got into office, and he was balancing which things he had to work on and push forward and which things he might be able to take a step back on or just leave as is, I think he realized he didn't have to go as far on mass incarceration as he thought, because even though we have huge racial disparities more than other states, our actual incarceration rate is not the highest. And so, okay, well, we're not in the most criminalizing place in the world, we're not the worst. But that's not really that great of a report card. But I think it was basically a politically expedient thing that, as someone who's supposed to come forward as a conservative, he doesn't want to push things too far. I don't think that he is specifically scheming about how to oppress Black people, but I think he's not thinking about the ways that his actions actually may have that effect. Now, so we only have a few more minutes, so this is a very rich conversation, but I want to just bring faith into this and just have us each share a little bit about, as we're looking at this challenge, what does our faith have to say about how we should be approaching it, or about crime and punishment more broadly?
So I'm going to sort of weave together what I was going to say. I think a large part of investing in these post-prison programs really is grounded in an an American cultural notion of individualism, right? That if you're incarcerated, it's because you as an individual are somehow flawed. And so for me, where my tradition speaks is to believe in the inherent worth of every person, but to also know that God calls us into community, and that each of us is diminished when any among us cannot live into their full potential. And so if we see this as individual flaws, we walk away from God.
And I think for us what comes to mind is also just our sacrament of reconciliation, which part of that is the same thing you're speaking of. People say, why can't I just say I'm sorry to God on my own? Because you've hurt the whole family. But that God shows mercy. You know, we give in that sacrament, penance, something you do to try to make up for that sin or to pay. But you're forgiven and you're back in society and you're still recognized as a person created in the image of likeness of God. So mercy and forgiveness is such a key part of our faith tradition. We have the sacrament for it. And it's the same idea of the way we should be looking at our prison systems too, I think.
You know, for me, one of my favorite scriptures, Paul says, I wish above all believers that you will prosper and be of good health, even as your soul prospers. And I feel like in the Black church, we're ever so concerned about life after this, life in heaven, and we're gonna walk the streets of glory. And I feel like I can't walk the streets of glory, truly. I can't enter the pearly white gates if my parishioners are not living their best lives. And I feel like in order for them to live their best life, there has to be a sense of reconciliation. There has to be a sense of grace that extends to every person, a spirit of forgiveness that extends to every individual. And that is my premise. Not that the crime isn't worth dealing with, but there is good in everyone, and there is forgiveness for every person.
Yeah, and I think that I would share that in the Jewish tradition, that there's just a belief in redemption, a belief that people can change, that the world can change, and that it's worth it to invest in people to make them better. So this has been such an interesting conversation. I feel like we could go on for another hour, and I just want to thank our viewers, and I hope that this will be interesting dinner table conversation for all of you, and maybe you can think about how does your faith and your beliefs guide you to think about how we can support people who have made mistakes to become better, and maybe also to support the American and Massachusetts community who may have made some mistakes in the way that we've structured our incarceration system to repent and renew and to become an even better system that creates justice for everyone. Thank you so much.